Verse 14, God gives us his name, I am that I am, which essentially means that he is who he is.
Man, how long did you study that one?
Slow that down for me, Popeye.
Welcome back to Pastorized, guys. We are going to attempt to get through the first 20 chapters, and so we're going to divide Exodus basically in part 1 and part 2, and so it's going to be interesting. But the good news is it kind of naturally breaks up in that way, because chapters 1 through 18, one of the things that I kind of wrote down, first of all, is that God is showing his great might in bringing them out. And so 1 through 18, they're lasting, through the Exodus, through the plagues. And then chapter 19 on Mount Sinai and 20 kind of starts that relationship with the covenant relationship. The rest of the book is kind of that covenant relationship, what it looks like with a holy God. And so that's kind of chapter 20 through the end with some other things mixed in there. Yep. But that's generally a good breakdown. What else are you guys seeing? Before we jump into the nitty gritty, what are you guys seeing in the overall big picture that we should kind of keep in mind, I guess, before we get into some of the details?
I would say overall for the story for me is just another story of God's preservation of his people. And so we're getting the historical details of that. But in that, we're also seeing so much of the character of God, which is where we went with Joseph and where we have to keep coming back to as we read this. This is a historical account, but there's revelation of the character of God throughout all of this that we've got to be looking for.
Yeah, along the same lines. As God has revealed who he is in Genesis, now we get to see even more. And, it's in Exodus chapter 4 that he actually gives us his name. So now we get to know him even on a more personal level. And the name Exodus is kind of the theme of the book too. Like, it's this deliverance of God's people. But in Hebrew, they just name this book, these are the names, which are the first 4 words.
These are the names. We used to do that with hymns, right?
Yeah, I know.
What are the first few words were?
First words are the name of the book.
Yeah, and when we put this in big picture of the story of God, period, and his redemption story, then the Exodus of the Israelites, so much corresponds. We obviously see that within the story of Jesus and going down to Egypt and all these different nuances that we can see in the story of Jesus, to where it goes from Exodus, deliverance of the Israelite people, to Jesus being the deliverer of humanity for all those who trust him. Yeah. And so we can see a lot of that and keep that in mind too.
Well, that it's almost unmistakable.
Yeah.
Reading it from the New Testament perspective, it's like, man, this is so much of this, just so straight on with exactly what God has done in redemption. Particularly when we get to the Passover and the type of that chapter for sure. Chapter 12 is so much.
Yeah, God knew what he was doing. Back in Exodus, knowing what was coming.
Yeah, and the detail is almost excruciating to the point where it calls God does not want us to miss some of these things because it is so impactful and so necessary for our theology.
Well, and I think as we go through, one of the other things that I keep mentioning, what I kept writing down, is God is foretelling what he's going to do. And so from the hardening of Pharaoh's heart to the plagues that are going to happen, and he gives the response and what's going to happen. He foretells, this is how you're going to do this. And I mean, it's just so much that God is telling them ahead of time who he is, what he's going to do, what's going to happen. So we see the sovereignty of God in all of this. And it's powerful. It kind of takes the story of Joseph and the sovereignty of God seen in that, and the way that Joseph says God has meant this for good, and so to save his people, he keeps escalating it up as far as how he's saving.
So for more nitty-gritty stuff, verse 12, the Egyptians oppressed them, and the more they oppressed them, the more they multiplied and spread, and I couldn't help but picturing the church within that.
I read the same thing.
And also just any of God's chosen people, and then God said it all the way back to Abraham, so you're blessed. And so we go see it throughout this book, you can't curse what God has blessed.
Yeah.
And so even though they try, and others are going to try, it just never works out. And so, they push down, and they just, they can't make it stop, can't stop, won't stop.
Sing it.
Yeah.
So
one of the other things that I noticed within this is Pharaoh's intent versus God's intent, as far as, again, that foretelling and stuff. So Pharaoh is seeing these people multiply, and he's trying to oppress, and he's like, let's deal shrewdly with them and stuff. And so he's basically trying to stamp them out, by killing all the males. Then obviously you've got an agenda here, right? And so he's basically wanting to make it so that they are non-existent. And so in my mind, it kind of goes to this idea of he's trying to wipe them out so that nobody remembers them, similar to what God says about the Amalekites later on. But God's intent is to save them. And even as we go into this, we see Pharaoh intends to forget and make these people unknown and annihilate them. God is saying, I remember, I hear, I see, as he mentions and calls out Moses.
Yeah.
And so I think that's
When
big.
if we're ever tempted to think, well, I mean, how could God allow it to digress this situation? We have to remember that like 700 years ago, God said this was going to happen.
Yeah.
It's not that He allowed it to. This was part of the plan.
Yeah.
I mean, and
With Abraham.
yeah.
Yeah.
And so while we may not enjoy all of the stuff we have to go through, we have to come back to, again, the sovereignty of God. This is part of the plan. He has a reason why, even if we don't know it. And we have to accept that this is not off track. This is on track.
Right. Yeah. Because to be able to be called deliverer, you have to deliver.
Yeah.
And so He's delivered them from this, and now He can be called deliverer.
Oh, man. And so much as I was reading this, I keep coming back to reality that we almost only perceive and recognize and feel in the felt needs. And all of it has a deeper spiritual meaning. And so back to the delivered reality, we only see it and feel it in our felt need life, right? And so God's allowing them to see and feel their physical need. But again, it's just a picture of the unfelt spiritual need.
Oh, man. And we're going to see that all the time
Yeah,
once they
it's-
actually get out in the wilderness,
Yeah,
right?
it goes deep in this book for
Wait,
sure.
wait, you're telling me there's allegory in this?
I'm telling you, this is a real historical account.
No,
But,
well-
yes, there's depth.
Yeah. And you see that with the New Testament writers. They,
Yeah.
Paul rips this story a new one and,
Yeah.
kind of interprets it through the eyes of the new covenant. So,
Right.
Yeah.
we can do that too.
So one of the other things that I noticed, at least coming from chapter 1, is when the midwives feared God in verse 17. And, we see that God blesses them. He dealt well with them in verse 20. So we're seeing this contrast of those who fear God and those who do not fear God. And fearing men basically is the flip side of that we often talk about. And so these Hebrew midwives, they feared God. They didn't more than they feared Pharaoh. And so they obeyed God as far as, no, we're not going to do this heinous thing. We're not going to help you commit this genocide,
Infanticide,
basically.
right,
Yeah. And so we're going to, well, I mean, they just tell them, well, they're strong women.
Yeah.
They come, they have them babies before we even really get there and help them out. So we can't
It's
really do it.
It's a total burn. My verse
Yeah.
says, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women.
Yeah.
They're tough.
Yeah.
Your people are powder puffs.
Well, and you see that too, because that's part of the reason why they want to keep them around, because they're like, we just want to sit by and do nothing all day is kind of the picture that you get.
Egypt had become America.
Yeah.
It's like, no, we had to.
Careful with that one.
We're gonna outsource everything, right? Just because we
Yeah.
don't want to have to do it.
And so he's blessing, those who fear him. And we're going to see that often over again, because he's making himself known. Like Josh said, he's given a more personal name, and he says that over and over again, that they will know who I am. And so whether it's the Israelites or the Egyptians, that they will know who I am. They will know my power, my might. And so we are faced again and again with this. Do we fear God? Do we want to know God
Right.
and see him? Or are we going to fear what's right in front of us?
That's
And
it.
so even the grumbling and stuff, the dependence.
And so as it continues in chapter 2, as they fear God, God rewards that they fear Him more than they fear man.
Yeah.
And so we end up with the story of Moses and his preservation as a child, and that's a fun story. It's Pharaoh at this point is trying to kill all the baby boys. It's the ruling is you got to throw all of them into the river, which they kind of did. Just they put them in a basket that floated. It was like it wasn't complete denial of it, but for me, as far as that chapter, what was most outstanding is that Pharaoh wanted all the baby boys dead, and he ended up with a Hebrew baby boy in his house.
Yeah.
It's like,
Yeah.
well, I mean, God knows how to add insult to injury, doesn't He?
Yeah, the irony.
It is. It's like, oh, that's what you're gonna do. How about this? How about I give you one as a son or grandson, for that matter?
Yep.
Yeah, he probably knew his daughter was going to be the death of him.
Right.
But she took pity. Yeah, she took pity on Moses, of course, and he's one of the Hebrew children. And so she knew full well what she was doing, and she probably knew full well what her dad's orders were.
Yeah.
And so, if one was going to be saved, it was definitely going to be one that she was involved with.
When I wrote down here, fearing God more than you fear man is a recipe for miracles.
Yeah.
So it's it puts.
Well, and even the boldness of a sister going up and saying, "Hey, I'll find somebody for you. Don't you want one of the Hebrew women to do the work for you, like nurse this child and bring him up a little bit until he's kind of past that hard work stage, because he's 3 when he kind of comes into her care, right? I think
Yeah.
it says that.
So I want to point out too in verse 10 when Pharaoh's daughter names him Moses, there's kind of a disconnect between the Egyptian culture and the Hebrew culture. And so when she names him, it's kind of in their language, basically born. You were born.
Yeah.
That's his name.
Ta-da.
Yeah, made it is
But-
probably the way we take it.
Yeah, like you were born, the born one, I think is what it literally translates to. But God in His sovereignty and His providentially, and in His providence, He has given him a name in Hebrew that means something more, which is to draw out, and that goes on to his deliverer title.
Yeah.
So, yeah, the the Hebrew people are set apart from the Egyptian people in this way, and what they think is just ordinary, God has something special for the Hebrew people.
It's unlimited, the wisdom of God.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's just,
Well, and in verse 10, it kind of makes it sound like Pharaoh, she named him Moses because she said, I drew him out of the water. So she seems to be defining it in the Hebrew way.
Well, that's what this is, according to some scholars, is like the writer is, if Moses was writing this, he's saying, my name is this because this is what it means in Hebrew. They would have said, she named him Moses in Egyptian, and she just named him that because it's what it means to her. But Moses is writing this down. He's like, this is what my name means.
From verse 11 and on, with the whole, he kills an Egyptian and then the two Hebrews are fighting and they're like, hey, how have you become a judge over us? Basically, I just see Moses' warring identity. He doesn't really have a place to belong in a sense because he is an Egyptian, but yet he's not accepted by his people. And his people are basically hesitant to listen to him at all. And as time goes on, once he comes back to deliver them, of course, he's got Moses, and of course, the elders do go along with it. And so that gives a lot of influence. But still, you've got to understand, he's got all this passion and desire for justice when he's taking care of the Egyptian and trying to protect his people, but yet he's not accepted by his people either.
so he has to flee.
Yeah, because his grandfather wants to kill him.
Man, basically that.
If we put it that way. Yeah.
I don't know why I was thinking that there may be somewhere else in the scripture that has led me to believe that he was like 40 years old at this point, and then he spent 40 years out tending sheep.
It does mention his age at some point. I don't remember exactly where. I don't know if it's right here or if it's in chapters to follow.
I just don't remember.
So I
seeing
feel
it
like the
here.
first time we get a mention of his age, he's 82.
Yeah, that
for
feels
80, and Aaron is 82.
Yeah.
And so
Yes, for sure we get
83.
that, but I was thinking that it said 40 at some point as well. But, you guys are reading, you'll find it.
yeah,
I mean, so there's amazement to me in that, at the age of 40, his life blows up.
Yeah.
And then he spends 40 years building a new life. And then at the age of 80, he's called to go to phase 3. It's
Yeah.
basically something major. And it's like, now you're going to really go to work. And I'm like, at 80? Okay.
Yeah, so here's where it comes into play. So when we said Pharaoh was trying to basically annihilate these people and wipe them off the face of the earth, they wouldn't be remembered. Then when we get down to 23 and 24 especially, here's where I'm really seeing it. I'm like, man, it says God heard, he remembered, he saw, he knew. And like that is, to me, when we stop and think about what is our greatest desires in life, we want that to be by other people, right? We want to be known by other people. We want to have communion with them. We want it to be heard. We want people to acknowledge us in terms of remembering and stuff. And so it's just that whole idea that, man, if the creator of the universe is doing that, remembering and hearing and taking, consideration for us and stuff, man, how big is that? And how powerful is that? To me, this 24 and 25 is absolutely huge.
I think it points to the personalness of God.
Yeah.
It's not just that he has preordained this, for eternity past. It's that he is also in the moment
Yeah.
with the people.
Perhaps we need to also address for people the idea of remembering. So did God really forget? And obviously we know that God didn't forget his covenant.
Yeah.
So what is that? How should we be taking that remembering idea?
well, the remembering is in response to hearing their groaning. They cried out their desperate cry because of their slave labor, and God heard it, and then he remembered his covenant. So I kind of see it as like it's giving like God a relational experience, like something that we can remember, or like we can do is remember things. God obviously has infinite knowledge in past, present, and future, and so he's obviously not forgetting, but I see it as like this is something that he can relate to humanity with.
Yeah, maybe a better word would be referencing.
Yeah.
He's referencing the covenant. This is why this is happening, because God has already promised it's going to happen.
Yeah. And I see it as like, in a sense, a nuance of he's not ignoring them. It's a way to describe that he's not ignoring them, because from their perspective, they were being ignored. And they will continue to say that in terms of, they're questioning, is God really with us?
Yeah, that's right.
If that cloud is not right there, are they...
Which it never left, so...
Yeah, it's like, is God really with us? Is he with you, Moses? Are you really the one? And so we're going to see that a lot.
Right, yeah, it doesn't stop here. It keeps going.
So in chapter 3, we get the calling of Moses. So he's in the land of Midian. His father-in-law is Jethro, who is mentioned as a priest of Midian. And later on, we see that Jethro understands that God that is leading Moses. When he comes to meet him in the wilderness, he's like, oh yeah, I believe your God is the God, is the God. We see that he is called up onto a mountain, and Horeb and Sinai, I had to look back into that to see if they were actually the same place or general region. And I think we get a little bit of a mix of that. There's sometimes it's used more broadly, sometimes it's used more specifically as far as a particular mountain. What are we noticing from 3, burning bush and calling?
I mean, I think
Moses?
we're pretty familiar with the story. I took note of, it's verse 6. Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. And this is like how Moses starts out, like with his relationship with God. He's hiding. But then we'll get to it later on in Exodus. He's asking to see God's face.
Right.
And so now he's built this relationship with God and he understands, more of who God is. Now he's like, I'm ready to see who you are.
God said, no, you're not ready for that.
Right. And, God still is like, well, I'll hide my face because if you see it, you'll die.
Right.
But, Moses hid his face because he thought he would die in that moment.
Yeah. I like verse 7 right after that. We see, I've seen the affliction, I've heard their cry, and I know their sufferings. And so what does he do? He comes down. And that parallels absolutely with
Right.
our turmoil and our suffering and stuff that we don't really recognize a lot, but need for salvation. And so, the fact that I love, and I tried to highlight that being like, man, he came down to deliver them.
It's good stuff.
Yeah.
Oh, I feel, Moses is hearing a literal voice. I don't think that this is something that's like he's just standing there and nothing's happening. I think he's hearing a literal voice from God, and God tells him to do something, and he argues with God back and forth like 5 times.
He's a child.
I mean, this is not the last time that Moses is going to have some boldness with God that we would shudder at.
Right. Yeah.
It was
Well, despite he's like, I hid my face because I was afraid to look at God, and now he's like, God, I don't know if I can do that. Like, I know you say I can.
But it does it's got to go down to the root of who he is. And then, obviously the same way for us too, that there are some things that we just can't get past or seem to get past because it is at our core, who we believe we are, who we think we are, all that type of stuff. And so Moses is really having a hard time with this because he's like, I don't know that I'm the one. I can't really talk. I think you should probably just go ahead and get somebody else. And so it's 4 excuses that he comes up with.
About so.
And I don't know if the 4th time is when he actually says, please get somebody else. He just comes out and says it. But
now, in his defense, for those who are listening, God is calling him to do some public speaking here.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, for a lot of people, they'd rather just die. So Moses was there. He was like, I just don't think that's going to happen.
Maybe that's why he confronted God in the first place. He was afraid to die at first, and he was like, hey, if I got to public speak, just go ahead and kill me.
Let's do this now.
But the intention of God is to bring these people out so that they can serve him. They're going to serve him on this mountain is what it says. And so we see the covenant law that comes in chapter 19, that is where they end up. So he enters into his covenant. And then verse 18, they're going to listen to your voice, talking about Moses. I'm going to make sure that they listen to your voice, and I'm going to bring them out into worship, 3 days journey, and they're going to sacrifice to the Lord. And this is a good thing. This is a good service. It's not like they're taking it, why'd you bring us out here? We're just going to die out here. It was much better, much more comfortable in Egypt.
Well, and he gives them the 411 of how all this is going to go down. He goes, say, let them go, and he's going to say no.
Yeah.
And then I'm going to show off. Yeah. And eventually they're going to let you go, and you're going to take everything with you. They're going to plunder them. And that's not the last time he tells them how it's going to play out. It's just, it's amazing that each time God is ahead of it with details.
So one of the things that as the plagues go through, especially in the beginning, every single one is saying, as the Lord has said, 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 as the Lord had spoken to Moses. I mean, it is constant where God has told him, not just Moses, but then Moses through Aaron to Pharaoh. He knows what's coming. And so sometimes it's described as Pharaoh hardening his heart. Sometimes it's described as God is hardening the heart of Pharaoh.
But at some point there should have been no doubt, right?
Yeah, you would think.
And it's like, well, I believe this is going to happen. I guess do your worst.
And we'll get there.
Verse 14, God gives us his name, I am that I am, which essentially means that he is who he is.
Man, how long did you study that one?
Slow that down for me, Popeye.
Say that 3 more times.
The word Yahweh comes from this. I am is basically the verb for Yahweh.
Yeah, the consonant letters.
Yep. So that's where we get that. And I think that there is something beautiful in this, and that like when God has revealed his character to us, he is saying that his essence is who he is. Yeah. And so when it comes to, we were to define who is God, he is.
Everything.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so there's some, deep philosophical things we could probably go into there, but we don't have to today.
Well, and when we get to the 10 Commandments, I mean, that's one of the things that we say when we're trying to say, okay, well, why did he give these commandments? The idols, well, that's one of them, is because there is nothing within the world that can truly represent God in a good way or in a better way or perfect way or
sufficient way.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, best is we've been made in his image. And so he's given us the task to be those icons, those images, as we've talked about.
Yep.
So he's calling him to the land of milk and honey. He says that I'm going to do this. When you mentioned that he's given this ahead of time, he's given this foretelling that I am going to be remembered through all generations. And so this is ultimately what God is going to do. And that is very, very true, because when we fast forward to the Old Testament and the New Testament, then this is a turning point when God is finally calling his people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. And then on top of that, the second half of Exodus, giving them this covenant relationship. Then now this is basically the instigating event, in the same way that the call of Abraham was huge. This is another huge turning point for the rest of his story of redemption.
You're right. From this point on, they are someone that some other nation is contending with.
Yeah.
From here on.
Yeah.
This is it. There'll be some type of war or skirmish or unrest around the nation of Israel.
Yeah. Well, and for a while, we always talked about define the relationship, right? And you probably even mentioned it in sermons before. But, when you are in a relationship, you have to define the relationship. And so, that's part of what God is doing within the law and giving the law. But he's like, hey, I am a holy God. You are to be holy as I am holy. And so here's how that is going to work out. And so we see the character of God even in that. So I also like in verse 21 how he says that you're not going to go out empty. And so God is providing. He's not just going to say, hey, this is what we're going to do. And you're going to plunder the Egyptians. There's how he kind of ends it up. So he gives Moses some powerful signs in chapter 4. What do we see? Moses still comes back with excuses, but
He gives him the staff that turns into a snake.
Yeah.
He gives him the hand that turns leprous and then clean again.
yeah.
And it's major stuff.
And then the water
Yeah.
to blood, yeah.
I was just taking note at, how many times God was patient with Moses. And then verse 14, God becomes angry with Moses.
Yeah.
Like, all right, dude, I've already told you, you're going to do this. And I just was reading that and I was like, okay, God expects obedience. When he tells you that you are going to do something, you are going to do it.
Well,
But, and he gives in to some of his demands. Like, I can't speak. Well, I'm going to send you with your brother Aaron. then,
Yeah.
And he will speak for
Well, and
you.
it's not like God did not know how this was going to play out.
Right.
He knew, and so Aaron's on his way.
Yeah.
I knew
Yeah.
where this was going.
Yeah. Well, and that's kind of where my mind went, as far as, obviously from Moses' perspective, he could only see it going one way, that he was the guy, and God, when his anger was kindled, then he reveals that, hey, I've got Aaron, your brother, he's a Levite, and he's going to spokesperson, basically. You're going to be as I am to you, you're going to be me to Aaron. And so it's just, it reminds us that God's got more in store.
Track forward a little quickly here. It's obviously Moses agrees to go with Aaron. Aaron be the mouthpiece. It's all good. And even God gives some more details about the firstborn idea of what's going to happen to Pharaoh, which in verse 22 is spelling it out, plainly
Right.
at this point. But then we get to verse 24.
And it's weird.
It is weird. So if you guys are reading chapter 4 and verse 24 and you think, I have no idea what this is about, then okay, you join the ranks with everybody that's gone before you. Because we don't really understand this fully either, this idea. So we understand the words. God is angry at Moses because it looks like he has not circumcised his children, his sons, which is a sign of the covenant. It's a big deal. And so we can understand from that perspective that Moses has not been faithful in regards to the covenant that God has made to his people in this particular aspect. And so, we believe that's probably the point of contention.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so his wife circumcises his boys. And that's, kind of where we lose a grasp of what's going on.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think there's also some archaic things that we can't understand here. And that's where most scholars end up. There's something going on that to us and through modern lenses do not understand.
Right.
And so things that differ from the way that the covenant would have been done, Moses should have circumcised
That's
his
right.
son, and instead his wife did it. And it kind of seemed like she appeased God with this.
Yeah.
And so that could have been something that they did, basically like, hey, I'm going to offer you a piece of flesh, God. And so that could have been that. Thing I read, I was, kind of talking through the wall with you earlier, was that there's some scholars that think that touching his feet is a euphemism for genitals. I don't know if that's true, but I read it multiple places, not just one.
Okay.
So there is a circle of people out there that think that's a euphemism.
Which just makes it weirder.
It does make it a little weird.
That didn't take it in the right direction. For me.
I would rather go along with the people that are talking about, well, when he's like, I'm going to put him to death, that he was already sick. And so Zipporah is seeing that, okay, something's got to be done. And somehow, even with that whole idea of touching it to his feet, that then God healed him.
Yeah.
It is definitely disobedience. I think that's what we can be confident in
Right.
as far as why Zipporah, had that kind of vengeful or spiteful type of
She
attitude
seems a
towards
little
that.
angry, doesn't she?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's hard to say, but
Somebody should tell her
we
to
would-
calm down.
Yeah, I would imagine that it has to be based on that Egyptian portion of Moses' life, that he's
Right.
trying to walk both lines perhaps.
Yeah.
And maybe we shouldn't read too much into it as far as trying to find where the lines are drawn. But Zipporah was at least willing to say, okay, well, I know how to make this.
Right. Yeah. So she has
That's
experience
better.
with her culture, and you
Yeah.
know, to make their gods happy, they have to offer something. So she was like, "Well, I'll make your god happy," and she offers something. It wasn't the correct way that it should have been done, but it got done. And God was like, "All right, this will work."
Well, and the other thing too is that it wasn't like God was just nitpicking or something. He had said it from the beginning that any one of these people, the male who did not circumcise the flesh, that they would be cut off from Israel.
Right.
This could be subtle foreshadowing of the Passover, and so the lamb's blood. You put that on the doorpost, you are saved. And so she put the bloody skin on his feet, so he is saved.
I don't even want to think about it.
Yeah.
At some point, like, look, if you don't understand this and you take nothing from it, there's so much more you can do here.
Well, and perhaps it could even be like, surely you are a bridegroom of blood to me, or however the translation puts it. She's seeing this as perhaps her attitude is this is archaic, or I don't want to do this, like in the same attitude that people would have looking back. Like that is one of the critiques that people have of the God of the Bible is why in the world would he make these people mutilate themselves?
Right.
And so even if you have to go back to just the point of God said it, and
That's right.
so we do it.
That's right.
Then that's maybe what she's saying. Well, you are a
Makes sense.
bridegroom of blood. Like you're God. I'm not ready to get on board, but sure, I'm going to appease it.
Because nobody else in the world was doing this.
Yeah.
Right.
And at that
Yeah.
point, the Israelites, but that was just a small group of people over in Egypt.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, some of that. And
I mean,
again, that
You say small, but 600,000.
well, it
of
is.
Yeah,
them.
a million and a half people probably.
It could have been a couple million, right?
Yeah.
But again, there's no tragic theology loss in this if we
Yeah.
we have no idea what's going on. It's
Right.
still okay. But there obviously it's a revelation that God wants us to have, so He put it in there. So, wrestle with it and then move on to chapter 5.
Yeah. So one of the things I do want to point out at the very end, 31, verse 431, this is a fulfillment of 3:18. They will listen to your voice. That when the people believed Moses, that Moses should be seeing at least first and foremost that, hey, you know what God said will happen is happening. So Pharaoh goes along with Aaron, of course, to Pharaoh, as it happens throughout the rest of the story. He's like, who is this Lord? He's not a God that I know, so why should I listen to him? And God's like, I'll tell you why. And so, we see all the different plagues. God is going to show him why he should know him and how he should know him.
My only takeaway between the 4 and 5 is like, Moses does some signs in the sight of the people at the end of 4, and they believed, right? And
Yeah.
to the point where they worshipped. Then you get down to the bottom of 5, and the people saying, "Why have you caused trouble? And why ever did He send you?" And it's so it's like these are some fair weather believers for sure. It's like if it is in just a few moments it turns quick, and we see that consistent throughout their relationship with God. It's in the big moments, they're ready to sing and praise and worship, but within minutes they're ready to doubt God completely.
Yeah.
And so this is kind of the first sign we've seen of that. Now that the daily quota got tougher for them. They weren't given the straw to make bricks, and so they're like, hey, this is no good anymore.
Yeah, and it's interesting, just the contrast again. They want to stick around with Pharaoh, essentially, have life as they know it. In verse 23, for since I came to Pharaoh to speak in your name, talking to God, he has done evil to this people, and you have not delivered your people at all. Which is interesting because he was told before that Pharaoh wasn't going to listen.
Yep. And so they're angry with Moses now.
Yeah, and then Moses is kind of turning around on God,
does
saying, "Hey,
kinda
you
turn
haven't,
on-
you haven't done
It's like-
anything. Like, what's
what
the
do
deal, God?"
It is kind of like that. He's kind of trying to call God out.
Yeah,
Again, there's some boldness in the guy that surprising.
yep. And so God reminds him in chapter 6, verse 1. He says, "Now you shall see what I'm going to do to Pharaoh. With a strong hand, he's going to send them out, and strong hand, he's going to drive them out."
There's a few signs that he did in Pharaoh's sight, and the magicians are able to match it. We get into the depth of the plagues over in chapter 7. Anything else we need to look at before we get into the plagues themselves?
I do like in verse 6 of chapter 6, he's going to bring them out from the burdens of the Egyptians. And he says, "I'm going to deliver you from slavery, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and great acts of judgment." And just the idea of the redemption in that. That's good that we're seeing that. Through that redemption, he's like, I'm going to take you to be my people, and I'm going to be your God. You shall know that I am the Lord your God. Chapter 7.
Yep, let's do it.
Yeah, so the first thing that happens is that, they go into, Pharaoh's court and, they throw down their staffs, and Aaron's staff eats up the magician's staffs.
Right.
Which is significant.
So that's the premise for the whole rest of the plagues, that the Lord is stronger than whatever you guys got.
Yeah. Our God is going to consume your God.
Yeah.
Yeah, basically that. That was the writing on the wall if they needed it.
Yeah.
So whatever you're trusting in is about to get consumed.
Yeah. So as we go through some of these plagues, the magicians could do the snake thing, they could do the water to blood thing, and they could summon the frogs. But even in the frogs, they couldn't get rid of them. And so each time, even when the magicians are able to do something, they can't do all of the things.
Well,
And
they,
so-
they can't undo anything they got
Exactly.
to do.
So,
So
they,
it's like-
they made more frogs.
Yeah.
It's like extra plague.
Yeah.
Bonus plague.
Yeah.
You got to think Favor was saying, but hey, can you get rid of them?
Yeah.
Well,
Oh, man.
taps out right there.
They could turn their staffs to snakes. They could make the water turn to blood. They could do the frogs.
Yeah. And then that was the
And
limit.
that was it.
Yeah.
Yep.
And again, each time I'm seeing as the Lord has said. So God has told Moses and he's told Pharaoh through Moses, this is what is going to happen. We know that Pharaoh is going to be hardened each time. And so even when we get to the point, I can't remember exactly which one, he says that he has sinned. When he finally acknowledges that he's sinned, basically, he still turns right back to it.
What I see through all of these plagues is that Pharaoh said in the beginning of, back in chapter 5, I do not know the Lord.
Yeah.
What these plagues do is reveal the Lord to him. So the fact that he was like, I don't know your God. God's like, I will show you who I am.
Yeah.
Yeah. He's going to show him by his great power.
Yeah, and it undermines his power, what he thinks he has control of. So he loses all control over his whole kingdom.
Interesting to me that he couldn't do the gnats. I mean, the
Yeah,
magicians
like-
could with some whatever secret magic demonic arts they had tapped out when it got to the gnats. I was like, well, can't do that.
I mean, I thought it was weird that they could summon frogs.
That is weird.
Yeah.
Yep.
So, it is supernatural that they're able to do this, but God only allowed them to do the water to blood and summon frogs.
Yep.
Well, and you've got to imagine that as these things progress, the people of Egypt are getting more and more tired with Pharaoh and his impotence, let's say.
Yeah.
That he
Yeah.
can't do the things. And especially if he's claiming to be God, then now all of a sudden he's powerless, essentially, in all these things. It also escalates. We see the escalation of all these things are more pervasive even. I mean, not that they weren't pervasive in the first place, because even the water to blood, they had to dig basically in order to get water, because we asked that question, well, where did the water come from? If everything, even the water they had in cups and, cisterns or whatever, they had to dig in order to find good water, basically. But
So one commentator was talking about this, and he was remarking that the magicians could only do their stuff to a degree where it wasn't creating. They could, however, whatever snake they used to look like a staff, perhaps turning water into blood, that was, it's going one direction. That's like creating death. And frogs coming up, didn't create anything there. It just summoned a bad thing. But when it came to the point where something actually came alive, that they were not able to do it, that it's a separation, that only God creates life, and that Satan can't counterfeit that.
yeah,
And so all he can do is bring death and destruction.
yeah.
And so they do a line there on the gnats, but that was just a commentator's opinion.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Doesn't say it.
Well, and so then the magicians, once they failed with the third plague and the gnats, they admit this is the finger of God. But Pharaoh's heart was hardened,
Yeah.
and he would not listen to them as the Lord had said. And so then we get into the flies, and this is where he starts separating his people are not going to have this problem.
Right.
It's at least clear in this case that the Israelites did not have this problem in the land of Goshen. Like the land of Goshen where they were residing was protected. In verse 23, it says, I will put a division. I'm not sure how yours translates, but in the Septuagint, it says set redemption between my people and your people. I thought that was
Yeah,
interesting.
that was interesting.
I didn't look into it any further than that, but
Well, I'm sure they were happy to have that barrier,
yeah.
but they'd probably been happy to have it earlier, right?
Yeah, they had to deal with no water and frogs and gnats.
The gnats, oh my goodness. I'd be like, I'm gonna move now. So by the time they get to the flies, they're not dealing with it anymore. And what's interesting, with the frogs, they just all died, and
They had to
Egypt
bird them or
with it,
something,
right?
yeah.
With the gnats, there's never a point where it showed them taken away. I don't know what the end result was on that. But with the flies, God removes them, and it's interesting. It says that not a single one remained. Boy, that's not easy to do.
Yeah, and that's the same that he does with the rest of them too. When Moses intervenes and prays, then God completely removes it as well.
I mean,
also the gnats, the Hebrew word is not very clear what it could have been, and so a lot of scholars think it could have been mosquitoes.
oof,
Because that would have been bad.
the people would have left.
Yeah.
I was like, hey, y'all got
Just wait until the boils come.
I'll take boils with mosquitoes.
If mosquitoes and then flies and then disease, I mean that kind of flows naturally.
Yeah,
it does. Yeah.
One of the things that we also see as a pattern is Pharaoh, as he's starting to relent, basically, which is never quite complete until the end, he's kind of making some sort of concessions. It's almost like he's bartering, is what I see. And so he's like, well, okay, go sacrifice to your God within the land. And Moses is like, that is not what God has told us to do. And so that's not going to be appropriate. Not only that, but your people aren't going to like that either, because, this is an abomination to them. And so then he kind of says too, you must only go, but not very far away, basically, in verse 28. And so Moses is kind of calling him out. He's like, dude, you've already cheated on this. And so, let us go, like God has said, and don't cheat again.
Pharaoh is a great example of who we are today, really. We don't want to experience the wrath of God, but we also don't want to surrender our lives to God.
Yeah, fully.
Yeah,
right?
it's like, it's whatever little bit we got to give to appease God so that we don't experience the wrath, we'll do that. But as far as like actually surrendering to him and saying, hey, you can have, I'm sorry.
You're fine.
I move every let's move some furniture while they were attached. But as far as us saying, hey, it's whatever you want is yours. It's complete surrender. That's a difficult place for people to get to. But, I mean, he does a great job of demonstrating this, what it looks like, and so we give a little bit, appease a little bit, But it's never full, and it's never lasting, and it's never sufficient. And so for those looking for true salvation, this ain't it.
Well, and I think that's good, and Scripture equates that to heart hardening.
Yes.
And so what seems to be like he's kind of on the fence, like, I don't want to experience this, but kind of I'll make concessions for you guys. You can go do it over here, just not do very far away. But his heart was still hard.
Yeah.
And so eventually it came to a point of no return.
That's it. Yeah. That's a sobering picture.
Yeah.
At some point, the next step is death, and not just physically.
Yeah. So with the livestock and stuff, God makes a distinction there in verse 4 between the livestock of Israel and livestock of Egypt. And so you can only imagine that then Egypt has to go to, if all their stuff is dead, then they've got to go to the Israelites, or at least confiscate them. Right. And Pharaoh's heart was hardened again there in verse 7. And so we're seeing this as a battle of wills. It's ridiculous when it comes down to it. But yet, as much as we say this is ridiculous, we still see ourselves in it. Hail.
Mingled with fire.
Yeah, and what's interesting here, for this time I'll send all my plagues on you yourself and on your servants and your people. And so if Pharaoh was somehow protected in some way, which we don't really get that idea, but at this time, at least, he's basically saying this is going to really, really affect you. And so that you may know that there is none like me on all the earth. Right. And so you got to understand that if there is any other gods that they're believing in, praying to, what have you, then God is setting himself up as definitely he is the one.
Well, this time Pharaoh confesses that he has sinned. The Lord is righteous.
Yeah.
And we are guilty.
And yet.
Yeah. Somehow it just didn't stick, did it?
Yeah. You are still exalting yourself against my people and will not let them go. I think that's a big deal too, that God is looking for that humility and that surrender, and it's just not coming. And also, I put a side note on verse 16 so that my name may be proclaimed in all the earth. This is not the type of evangelism and testimony you want.
Yeah.
He says, but for this purpose, I have raised you up to show you my power so that my name may be proclaimed through all the earth. And so this is God saying, this is why I've raised you up, Pharaoh. Yeah. And this is not the type of testimony nor the evangelism I want to do.
And it kind of gets back to the heart of the matter in verse 3 of chapter 10, how long you refuse to humble yourself. And so that's the word for all of us, It's just a matter of humbling ourselves before God. You humble yourself and you have mercy, grace, and if you don't, then you have resistance.
Yeah.
God says he resists the proud and gives grace to the humble.
Yeah, and he's the only one at this point, because in verse 7, even his servants are like, how long are you going to let this man be a menace to us?
Our place is runt.
Yeah. But, at this point, it's God hardening Pharaoh's heart, because he hardened it too much, and, God foretold what was going to happen.
Right.
And so...
Yeah.
When we preach that, God does not owe anybody multiple opportunities, right?
Right.
And so if you say no, then who's to say you get another chance? And so there's
Well, and we might need to address that a little bit too, because I know that is a hard thing for people to accept as far as that whole idea of hardening, God being the one responsible for hardening. And so just putting it out there, it's a lot easier for people to see it as Pharaoh has made these choices, made these choices, made these choices. And so now God is responding to that choice that Pharaoh has made over and over again. And so God is now hardening.
Yeah.
But when we're being foretold that God is doing this from the beginning and from the first one, it says that God is going to harden his heart. I don't see it as just a foretelling. In my mind, it is God has a part in this, even in that I've raised you up to show you this. And the way the New Testament writers interpret it too, that I have raised up Pharaoh to show glory and that he was going to be, in this place, and he hardened his heart. And then same thing very similarly when he says, and we dealt with it before, Jacob I've loved and Esau I've hated.
Yeah. It goes back to the friction that we have between God is sovereign and man is responsible. And it's a reality that it still exists. And so anytime we put too much emphasis one way, it can reduce the other one to an unbiblical perspective. Pharaoh's still responsible for his choices.
Yeah, because God is not an author of sin. We see that in
That's
James,
right.
right?
That's
Yeah.
right.
Well, I think a lot of times we look at Romans 1, this says, for all they knew God, they did not glorify him as God or give thanks to him. They became futile in their thoughts, and their senseless hearts were darkened. They claimed to be wise. They became fools. They exchanged the glory of the immortal God for image resembling mortal human beings. And so then in verse 24, therefore God gave them over.
Yeah.
And so
That's right.
this is that giving over.
Yeah.
Yeah. At some point, it crosses the line. It's like, well, okay.
Yeah. Like if
We'll-
that's
we'll
who
do it
you
like
are going to
this,
serve,
right?
you are going to serve them.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like
So
you don't want to have anything to do
you
with
will
me.
still be part of God's glory, just not the way you want to be.
Yeah.
The way anybody wants to be. It's going to be, like Michael was saying, a bad reputation, not a good one.
Right.
I get the feeling that Pharaoh is really just trying to play the game too, because down in verse 17 of chapter 10, he's like, "Forgive my sin, please, only this once. Just one more time, just one more
Yeah,
time, just one more
right.
time." Right? Again, this is where part of where I see the mercy is because, God knew Pharaoh's hard heart. He knew where he was. He knew that he didn't fear him, that he hadn't humbled himself, and yet he does still turn away. The locusts. He still does remove them. Now, I would also put that you can't take that apart from what he's still going to do.
Yeah.
But he did show mercy in that regard.
Quick.
Then-
Go ahead.
Nope.
Oh, I was just going to have a little nerd out moment real quick.
I knew it. I'm
Yeah, I
not
know.
going to move forward.
I gotta have it. We often will, say that okay, these plagues correspond to Egyptian gods,
Yeah.
and so I looked at, are there ancient rabbinical texts that talk about this? Would the Jewish people have understood this to be these are directly correlated to Egyptian gods? And so I wanted to know. So I read some old Hebrew stuff, obviously translated in English because I don't know any Hebrew, and chapter 10 is the only one that they would attribute to their sun god, which I thought was interesting in the plague of the locusts,
Instead
not
of
the
darkness,
plague of
yeah.
darkness. And it's because it says,
Dark in the sun.
yeah, the locust went up over all the land of Egypt and settled down in all the territory of Egypt. It was very severe. There had been no locusts like them before. They covered the surface of all the ground so that the ground became dark with them. And so since the ground became dark, they translate that or I guess they kind of understand that as, so the sun was darkened by the locusts. And they're like, that's obviously a
Attack
hint.
against
Yeah,
the
they're
sun
attacking
god.
their sun god. But also the plague of darkness,
Yeah,
obviously.
for sure. Yeah.
Attacks the sun god too.
That was
I was like, this guy is really reading into this, but okay.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not going to argue with it because I don't know the Hebrew text well enough to be able to argue it, but I know what I got in English, and that's it.
So with the plague of darkness, I just had a question of how the darkness can be felt in verse 21.
I don't think you want to find out.
I'm not saying that I do. I'm
saying
curious.
experientially we can't answer because we don't
Yeah.
have it. I don't know. Maybe there was even a moisture to it. I'm not.
Yeah, and my mind did go there. Obviously, we understand, at least to a certain extent, days that are, middle of the summer, but it's just dark outside because of thunderstorms and whatnot, and how quickly that can change even. And so if this was just even more than that, then feeling it, but still, I don't know. I just see it as man, that's definitely, at the very least, take it as it is. That just adds more to their blindness. They're
Yeah.
reaching, they can't go out of their house
Well,
because
You
they
got to
can't
think
see.
fog. I'm gonna die here on the camera. Fog is only white because of light.
Yeah,
Right.
You get rid of all the light, and fog's not white. It could have been something.
Still feeling it, yeah.
some type of essence of a cloud type.
I think we
felt,
could
but-
spiritualize this some too. I mean, the only light was on the Israelites, and so the darkness was over all of Egypt. And what is God? God is light. Absence of light is dark. Absence of God is darkness.
Right.
And I think we would know if God departed from us.
Oh,
And so that's what I think we can read into. It was darkness so thick it can be felt. God
Yeah.
literally was like, I'm going to walk away from you right now.
well, and it had been something even deeper for them than just the physical. There
Yeah.
was probably something internal that was desperate in these moments. And 3 days,
Yeah.
3 days that they couldn't move. It was so dark. I'm like, man, we don't really stop and consider all the implications of that. And
Yeah.
so you're not preparing food.
Yeah.
You're not going to the bathroom, at least where you want to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so this place was a mess. The entire Egyptian people would have been like, I mean, you would
Well,
think.
and if you're scared of the dark too, I mean, how much is it going to play with your head? Like,
Yeah.
I mean, people go crazy. Like
Yeah,
that is
yeah,
torture.
yeah,
like,
yeah.
especially if people are put in water and then pitch black darkness. But I mean, anytime our senses are taken away, whether it's we're in a completely silent room, they have that and people go crazy. Like when you can hear your own blood and moving through your veins because the room is so quiet. The darkness and other things too. But man,
yeah. I think this would make you afraid of it. I think
Yeah,
from here on,
exactly.
there'll be some PTSD
What was
every
that?
night.
What was that?
Right? Yeah.
But so Pharaoh, when he relents, essentially he's saying, make sure your little ones also may go with you. Only let your flocks and herds remain. And you got to understand, he knows what they're wanting to do.
Yeah.
He knows what's been commanded, and so he's like, okay, well, I'm going to let It seems like it's such a great deal, but again, he's like Moses. He just calls him out for it. He's like, dude, what do you think we're going to do?
Yeah.
How are we going to have animals?
Have
Like, we got to take
sacrifices.
that with us so that we can serve
Yeah.
God in a proper way. But again, the Lord hardens Pharaoh's heart. And so, get away from me. I'm never going to see your face again. Like, don't, this day you see my face, you're going to die, Pharaoh says. And Moses is like, all right, yep, that's pretty much what's going to happen. I will not see your face again. And so then we've come to the final plague with the Passover. So we'll take this all together, I guess. There's foretelling as far as
Yeah, I mean,
that
this didn't come-
he'll let him go after this and
Yeah.
stuff.
Well, also, it wasn't just out of the blue. I think it's ironic, but also it's just the way that God has, orchestrated things. Pharaoh says, I'm going to kill all of your firstborn. And God turns it around and says, no, I'm going to kill all of your firstborn.
That's right.
Because you
And
haven't
protects his own too.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So that's kind of where we are starting off with this plague.
And so along with this, he's telling them not only about the lamb and what they're to do with the lamb and bring it in for so many days before you kill it and all that. He's also saying you need to go and request golden jewelry basically from these other people, from the Egyptians. And part of that is they find favor in
Yeah,
the sight
and
of
they
the
give it to
Egyptians. Yeah. And that's crazy. Like
Yeah.
crazy to go ask for it.
Yeah.
Which I guess maybe not, because if the Egyptians are seeing that, hey, they're being plagued and the others are not, then they're like, sure, yes, take everything we got. Like, this is not even anything to us. Like, just make this stuff stop. So it's interesting along with this too, as we can continue through the Passover and what all that means. It's not just that the Egyptians' firstborn are going to be killed, but that as soon as they're out, God says, you need to redeem your firstborns. And so not just from your people, but also from your cattle.
Right.
And so this is one of those things that God is showing his power to the Egyptians in the plague, but also he's showing his power when they're seeing that. They're saying, yes, okay, yes, God, we will obey. We will redeem our firstborn, knowing that you have the right to it, type of idea.
Yeah, maybe we should kind of break this up because chapter 12 kind of gives us three distinct things. We have Passover, and then we have the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and then we have this redemption of the firstborn, basically. And so the Passover was when they killed a lamb, and they put the blood over their door. And as the Lord passed over, if he saw the blood, he would not have wrath, so he wouldn't kill their firstborn.
Right.
Well, and this is so huge in so many different ways, and so many people that are listening are probably thinking, "Yeah, we're
Right.
tracking with you.
Yeah.
We know what's coming." But just the fact that it's a new marker for days and seasons. This is now going to be your first month. This
Yeah.
is now
Right.
going
This
to be.
changes everything.
Yeah, exactly. In the same way that Jesus, when he came and was the ultimate sacrificial lamb, like this Passover lamb, then we start counting days differently. We now use Sunday as the Sabbath day instead of Saturday. And so, I mean, everything changes. And so we're seeing this as they're entering into a covenant, and then with Jesus comes the new covenant. And so just all the different nuances.
And
within
whenever
that.
we accept his sacrifice, it's a new beginning for us.
Yes.
As well. So as it continues.
New life, yeah.
Yep.
And so obviously, again, not to be lost on the fact that it is blood. Blood is required.
Yep.
And so this is kind of the beginning of some of that. Not that they didn't ever have sacrifices before, because we can definitely see that beforehand, but just that blood is required. And God told him that from the beginning when he gave animal skins to Adam and Eve.
Well,
Yeah.
because the life is in the blood.
Yeah.
And the price of sin is death. It costs life. And so to I mean, that's what you got to pay. You sin, and so the exchange of that is life. You have to give life for sin, and so now we're seeing it, and all the way back to the garden, right? Even from the very first, life had to be sacrificed for the covering, and not that, and we'll obviously get this later. Not that any of these things are sacrificed equal the value of man, because obviously a lamb is not worth as much as a child, which that's what they're going to use to redeem it, right? But he still point to the fact that something has to die in your place, and this is going to do for now.
Yeah, it's repeated over and over again, so I think it bears repeating in this context that he says you're going to keep it as a memorial day for generations forever, basically, a statute forever.
Yeah. Well, and this is where the Lord's Supper comes into play too, because this is what Jesus was doing. He was celebrating Passover when he instituted the Lord's Supper. So,
and there's a high probability that this is the passage we're looking at Sunday, and we're going to do Lord's Supper.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, nice.
Yeah.
It's not on the calendar, but we're going to make it happen.
So maybe we won't ruin it too much.
That's why I'm saying pretty quiet over here on this one.
I got a little nerd moment again.
Give me something.
All right. This is the passage that a lot of Roman Catholics will use to support transubstantiation because they ate the lamb.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so because in this, they literally ate the lamb. So Jesus was giving the Lord's Supper, obviously. So it's literally flesh.
Yeah, I was going to say we might have to just define it for some people.
Oh, yes. So transubstantiation is the belief that as you take the sacraments, they literally turn into Jesus' flesh as the bread and his blood as the wine.
And that's paired with the fact that he says, you must surely eat of my flesh. And,
that passage in John.
Yeah.
So, there's a lot of support, but this is one of the main ones that is the earliest.
Interesting.
In Scripture. So,
and we do not take that literally.
We do not. No.
As far as, as a staff here, we don't believe in that idea of transubstantiation.
Well, it comes down to semantics anyway, because their main argument is Jesus said he didn't say it's like my body and it's like my blood. He said it is. And then it goes back and forth like, well, did you think his parables were literal? So there's just arguments all over the place.
Yeah. Well, and there's room for confusion because even when he said it, it was such a hard saying that people stopped following him.
Yeah.
They thought, cannibalism? This guy's he's a nut job.
Right.
They can't follow that.
But there's still, something sacred about it because Paul obviously had to warn the Corinthians that, if you don't take this worthily, then you will probably get sick and die.
Yeah.
And you've already seen that here.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So this is also the same. Like, you guys have to celebrate this.
Yeah.
That's why he says it several times.
And I think what we're going to look at is the degree of God's care over this particular feast, the sacrament, if you want to use that, even moving forward into the New Testament, because of what it illustrates and how holy it is.
Yeah. So we'll, tune in, or, well, really better show up on Sunday.
Don't tune in.
I'm thinking tune in terms of podcast, but show up on Sunday. Within the death of the firstborn, I wrote in my margin, complete judgment, and then finally comes complete release, as far as Pharaoh finally letting them go in the ways that God had determined that they would be. They left in haste in the same way that God had told them that they would. You need to eat this Passover meal with your staff in hand and unleavened bread, and there's a lot of different nuances within that. And so they have unleavened bread when they leave. They do plunder the Egyptians as foretold from 3:22, and they leave. They're rushed out, basically. Get out.
Side note, Pharaoh summoned them in verse 31. Even though he said, if you see me again, I'm going to kill you. You won't survive it. And he summoned them, and they survived it. And it's just interesting because Pharaoh was a god, right? In the Egyptian culture, he's God. Everything God said came to pass. Pharaoh, not so much. Maybe you're not a god.
Yeah. So within the institution of the Passover, just finishing up chapter 12, it's interesting that, the same correlates to the Lord's Supper, that, the warnings, especially eat unworthy, certainly you're unworthy if you are not among the body of Christ. Right. And in this case, if you're not part of the covenant, if you have not been circumcised and become a Jew, basically, then you can't eat the Passover. We move on from there, chapter 13, firstborn, the consecration of the firstborn, which is very quick. We see more of it later, but this is very quick. He just kind of tells them to do it.
Yeah.
The Feast of Unleavened Bread and the pillar of cloud and fire. What are we seeing from chapter 13 or into 14 perhaps?
13, I don't have a whole lot that I won't at least pull from on Sunday. 14, just the fact that he did not remove the pillar of cloud by day or the pillar of fire by night.
Yeah.
So for the next 40 years, this is going to be a standard for them. So even in the moments where, hey, why is there no water? It's like, well, God's still here, right? or why is there no food? Well, I mean, obviously God hadn't left us, which is what their complaint's going to be. Where's God? And why is he not here, basically, is what they're saying. It's like, well, there's evidence all around you, man.
So it's interesting, a couple things in my mind. One, in 13:16, he says, it shall be a mark on your hand or frontlets between your eyes and be a strong hand. And that's, he labels it more specifically. You're going to carry my scripture, my word on tie it around your forehead and bind it around your arm, basically, as we get there in the, with the law. But the other thing that I also thought was interesting is that God, he says in verse 17, when Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them by the way of the land of the Philistines, although that was near. It's kind of like that's the shorter way, but I'm not going to do that because lest these people change their minds when they see war and return to Egypt. And they're like, wait a minute, God, I got a question, because they still have that same response and attitude. As soon as hardship comes, and when they come to the Red Sea, which is where he led them, and the Egyptians pursue, then it's like, but they're thinking war and they want to go back.
Yeah.
They're like, we're going to die here. And so, I don't know. It was just interesting to me. But God is their provision, their protection, and he is their presence, like you mentioned. Those are the big things that I see.
Right.
And so when they're kind of stuck in a corner with the Red Sea, many of you guys are familiar with the story, so we won't go into the details, but kind of happened at night. We don't usually think about it that way, at least pre-dawn and into dawn.
One particular point here where the NET version translated it, I would say, uniquely. Verse 19, the angel of God was going before the camp of Israel, moved and went behind them, and the pillar of God moved from before them and stood behind them, and it came between the Egyptian camp and the Israelite camp, and it was a dark cloud, and it lit up the night, so that one camp could not come near the other the whole night. And so some other translations do a little bit better job of that. It was darkness behind them and light in front of them, because God still was in front of them with a fire, right? The pillar of fire was in front of them, and the cloud was behind them, and so the cloud is reflecting light from the fire in front of them, so the Israelites had light, but on the other side of the cloud there was just darkness, and so it was a separation there where the Israelites were in light and the Egyptians were in darkness. Is really how that works out. And so
that's a good picture of it.
Yeah, darkness on one side, light on others, and so some of your translations do a little bit better job of making that obvious. And so if our readers are reading this one, they're like, oh, what? It's light and it's dark? Well, yes, it is.
The other thing I see in chapter 14 is, they do start murmuring. We see the first murmuring that they kind of have and complaining that, God has brought us here just to die, basically in the desert. It would have been better for us to, still be in Egypt or die there or something. But you see, again, the fearing God versus fearing man. And so obviously they're fearing man. And so the comfort is in verse 14. The Lord's going to fight for you. You just have to be silent. And that's huge. And it's also very hard because we don't want to be silent. We want to have a part in it. We want to see it. We want it to go our way or what have you. We don't want to just wait on God.
So this is a consistent chant that they have. I'm going to underline it in my Bible. Is it because there are no graves in Egypt? And this is like a sarcastic dig, right?
Right.
Mm-hmm. Why do we have graves in Egypt? Couldn't just die there? We had to bring us out here to die?
Yeah.
It's rude.
A little bit.
Yeah. Well, they're saying it to Moses, but they're really saying it to God.
That's it. Yeah.
Yeah.
And Moses points it out here in a few minutes, like, who are we? Like, you're saying it at us, but obviously God's in control here.
So what's interesting is that the Israelites are complaining and saying, God, are you really there? Are you going to, handle this or whatever? And then in verse 25, the Egyptians acknowledge that. And again, that was foretold. It was foretold that the Egyptians were going to come and what God was going to do. And so now it says, for the Lord fights for them against the Egyptians. And so they're terrified because they're seeing the power of God. And so then we come to verse 31, when God is showing this mighty power, this great power, it says, so the people feared the Lord and they believed in the Lord and his servants Moses.
For a minute.
For a minute. Yeah, because that's where I was about to go. Because we have chapter 15, which is beautiful. And I think I kind of questioned myself, is this the first time that we have like more than just a brief song or mention that they had a song? But this is the first one that's kind of listed out and spelled out for us.
Yeah,
people singing.
Well, and for those tuning into the podcast, you're in for a treat because Josh had prepared a demonstration of this.
It's going to be a banger.
He was singing it earlier in the office, and man, it was a humdinger.
His head was bobbing.
And I did it in Hebrew too, so
which is even more special.
Speaking in tongues.
I'd really like to hear this.
Oh yeah, sorry, that's just between me and the Lord.
Yeah. Nice. Well, we did mention we were discussing that this does not rhyme at all. There's no parameters here where we can see how this could possibly go as a song, at least in the English version.
Yeah,
so perhaps in Hebrew it flowed better. Hard to believe, but perhaps.
I mean, we find it in the Psalms too. Where,
it is, right?
They're all supposed to be poetic, but to us they're like, well, this isn't metered or rhythmic.
Yeah.
It doesn't rhyme.
Well, people have put a lot out of it even still.
Yeah.
It's amazing how many songs have come out of the Psalms, but I agree with you. Just reading it straight, it's like, we'll have to work on that.
As someone who has been in a room writing songs from Psalms, you have to pull up like every Bible translation just to help you like understand the words,
Gotcha.
so that you can you can really piece these things together.
Major thesaurus action going on.
Yeah, it is.
Find something that rhymes and works, right?
Yep.
Randall does that when he alliterates his sermons, like this past Sunday.
You ain't kidding. I love it.
This past Sunday, I told Billy and Josh, I was like, I might have to tease him on the podcast.
Yeah.
Like, you could tell that you had 2 weeks to prepare that one.
I'm thinking of a number.
There's a lot of alliteration in there. Like some S's and some P's.
Yeah, man, this is easy stuff, though.
Yeah.
P is always easy. There's a preponderance of them.
Well, I mean, I just had some too in his presence, provision, protection.
Yeah.
Anyway,
That's just old school preaching. At some point, maybe I won't do it, but probably not. I'll probably keep doing it. I just like it. It's not necessary.
it's great in my mind because this is God-centered worship in terms of they're saying and repeating all the things that God has done and the glory that He has and the power that He has, and even the point of it, like even in what He has done for us in a sense is for His glory and by His name. So
And the nations will hear and tremble, and that happened.
Yeah.
People were afraid of Israel after hearing of what happened in Egypt.
Yeah. And that He's bringing them to Himself, to His abode, to the sanctuary that your hands have established, and then it declares His reign forever and ever.
They came from a culture where they celebrated and worshiped multiple gods, and now they're coming out of that, and they can finally like sing a song to the one true God and list, like you said, what He's done, but also who He is back to them, who is like you. You are. That's basically His name. You are. Mm-hmm. And so they get to do that in a beautiful poetic way, hopefully in Hebrew, but not in English. But
now Miriam's song here on the drum, I can hear this one. This one's not so hard for me.
Tambourine.
Yeah, that's the hand drum.
Yeah.
I mean, I could see how this could go, but we won't do it.
yeah.
But 3 days pass.
Yeah, just 3 days.
Yeah. And the people grumbled. And so they forget, essentially, God is reminding them of their dependence. And so this is what we're going to see as a pattern too,
right.
That, when they go to gather the manna, it's only for one day, except for, gather 2 for the Sabbath. And when they gather too much and there's some left over, it stinks, it's rotten, but yet in the time that they need to gather extra for the Sabbath, then it's not, it doesn't stink, it doesn't rot. And so this is just a constant reminder that God is their dependence, or as far as like their dependence upon God for everything. And I think that's the point, really, when it comes down to it, and the lesson that we are constantly learning as well.
It's no spiritual application, but they're a full month in at this point. This is 30 days, basically, give or take of time out of Egypt. I mean,
the 15th day there in chapter 16.
Yeah,
it's about a month away.
So I mean, that's a long. I mean, what were they eating? I don't know what they were eating for the first 30 days. I guess they made a bunch of bread and they had lots of animals.
Yeah, maybe this is the time they're running out.
Yeah, maybe this is.
I mean, you would think they'd mate their animals so they'd have more, but I don't know.
I mean, it takes time too, though.
Yeah, it does.
So.
Not in 30 days.
No.
Yeah.
Well,
And there's
and you can't
close
eat
to
too
2
many
million.
animals, or
If there's close to 2 million people, then that stuff will go fast.
for sure.
God is definitely taking care of them, just not in the way that they want to. And He also says that He's going to test them whether they will walk in my law or not. And so this is the trust that we see. Are they going to trust Him? And He's going to give the law, and give that covenant and stuff. But this is what we're seeing. It's kind of like the first time.
So part of this I wrote down. It's from the Lord's Prayer, give us this day our daily bread. We kind of get to see some of that in action right here. It's where we don't so focus on the future that we don't spend the presence in trust and faith, right? And that's kind of the goal. We don't want to rely on our abilities to provide. We want to rely on God's faithfulness to provide, which is a better provision anyway. And that's an ongoing struggle I think we have, is whether we're relying on Him or relying on ourselves, and knowing where that balance is, where we work hard and do our best, right? And that's biblical, as well as walk by faith before God, which is also biblical. And so I don't have an answer to that equation, but I realize we're seeing it here where, they want to, gather up because they're uncertain, right? And God already told them, no, don't do that. And so it becomes sin.
Yeah, and Moses is angry. And
Did we talk about instituting the Sabbath in this?
He spells it out more clearly, yes.
Yeah, okay.
I think one of the things that I kind of alluded to it before, but they are in their constant grumbling, and yet God is showing them over and over again their need to depend and trust in Him. Even with God's mighty works and stuff, what comes out of that is so many testimonies so many memorials, so many remembrances, so many altars, so to speak, that they set up. And I think it's all in reference to remember. The Sabbath day is a constant reminder. Every week it comes around. We celebrate Christmas, we celebrate Easter, and that's the stuff that we have. But man, when you look back at everything that they had, it was a constant sign, because God knows that we need it. We are very short memory type people. We forget. And so I just think, when God is saying that he's going to give them, meat and then manna, that they're going to know that he is God. Well, the rest wasn't enough. Like, that's what we keep thinking about. And yet that's how we live our lives. We forget. But
we're sheep.
Yeah.
We're not so bright. And so we desperately do need something from God on a daily basis.
Yeah.
And so that daily bread is obviously, again, deeper than just the physical.
Right.
The reality is we need the daily bread from God. Even though God has done the big moments in our lives, and we can look back and say, yes, God is totally in control, and God is good, and God is sovereign, and God is near. Yet we still need it on a daily basis, just because it's our nature.
Well, and if that wasn't enough, when he told him, take some of the manna, put it in a jar, and it's going to last, basically, and it ends up in the covenant, or the ark of the covenant, and it's like, they're going to have to keep going back to this.
Yeah.
Keep remembering what God has done. He showed himself faithful every single day for 40 years.
Well, and I love too the fact that his word is so accurate that whenever he says it, it becomes reality, right? So it says, if you get more than a day, it won't last. It didn't. But on the on the fifth day,
Sixth day.
Yeah,
Sixth
so
day.
seventh.
Gather
You get a
blessing.
double portion because
You
it'll
get it,
last
right.
for tomorrow.
And so it's supernaturally preserved.
Yeah.
It's like, it didn't work any other day, but on that day it will work. Oh, why? Well, just because God said so.
Yeah.
That's the
And
only
he
difference
sustained
there
it.
is.
It was a supernatural thing.
Well, we talk about, the idea of Ebenezer's, we set up this stone of remembrance because, God has been faithful to us. And so when we go through the mundane, it's everyday life, God is supernaturally blessing us. Like, he's sustained life, he's given you another day. But we do have to go back to those things and remember, like, okay,
Right.
God, I'm having a hard time today. Can you show me something that, just remind me of your faithfulness and your goodness to me?
Yeah, well, and honestly, I want that every day, right?
Yeah.
It's I sincerely want to be in the presence of God every day. I want to hear from him every day. I want that encouragement, because once you've experienced God speaking to you and directing you, and there's something so rich in that and so exciting about it, like, why wouldn't you want that every day? And so, I think it's okay to want it every day.
Yeah.
And it's also, just to a degree, it's not safe to try to become the spiritual camel, right? Where you get a little bit and try to go a long ways with
Right,
it.
right.
It's like, that's really not biblical. I said, come on out every day. I'll have it for you.
There's constant grumbling. We see that, and we will continue to see that. They grumble about the food. They grumble about the water. They grumble about, just basically whatever tends to be their thing at the moment.
It's hot. I don't know.
And one of the things, it keeps coming back, and I think one of the good ways to summarize it is in 17:7, is the Lord among us or not? And that's what you guys had talked about and alluded to as well. And that's what we say. Is the Lord really good? Am I really his? Is perhaps a question that we have sometimes. It ultimately comes down to those questions of God, or his character, or his care for us, his love for us. And those are the two true questions that we think about. We see the first warring, and this is where, basically we believe that this is why God wants the Amalekites wiped out.
That's right.
And he tells them that. He tells them as such. He's like, I'm going to utterly blot them out from under heaven. Joshua comes out of nowhere. He helps defeat,
Comes out of nowhere.
he's the main, we don't see him up until this point.
Right.
He becomes a major player.
Right.
It was clearly God had done that, because anytime Moses dropped his arms, then they would start losing. Raised up his arms, they would start winning. But Joshua we see him right away as the conqueror, in a sense, this victor.
I see a consistency where the doubting of God is the natural result, I guess, of unmet expectations, which comes back to the reality that we are so focused on what we want that we will doubt God when we don't get what we want. It's a very childish thing to do, right?
Yeah.
When all, especially after all that he has done. So we can get to see just the immaturity of Israel and even ourselves, and a lot of what's going on throughout the wilderness. It's, so some of the lessons we got to learn is how to deal with unmet expectations. And, of course, the answer to that is trust, right? God's way is sovereign, and that his is good.
And I think we mentioned it too. I mean, you've got to have that daily reassurance, or moment by moment within the day. And so sometimes that means that you are going back to God's word and trusting what he's saying. Sometimes it's going back and remembering what he has already done in the past. It's all around.
Well, God promises to sustain, not to make everything easy.
Yes.
And so we want everything to be easy and without hardship, but they have to live in a desert.
Yeah.
But God is still sustaining them literally every day.
Yeah.
And is physically manifesting his presence.
Yeah.
And
And as I've read through this, again, I came back to the reality that part of the hardship is our benefit, not that God makes us suffer so that, we will look for him. But apart from the felt need issues, we don't find the spiritual solutions.
Yeah.
And so we keep coming back to that. Yeah, God allowed them to feel some physical issues so that they would come to the reality of the spiritual solutions. And so I feel like that's part of our life journey as well. We come to some suffering in this life, but it's just part of the process that allows us to say, okay, it's not really about this life.
Yeah.
There's something deeper going on here.
I find chapter 18 kind of comedic. Do you guys?
Yeah. Just because Jethro comes and
okay, so
he's like his wife wasn't there. And
no, what I find comedic about this is like, father-in-law comes in, obviously, he's got to look at this and be like, I think we could do something better.
Yeah. Just like a father-in-law.
Right, yeah. And so, he's got to correct and you kind of make it, he's got to just put his hand on it,
It's like, hey, son, let me talk to you about it.
Also, the comedic part to me is that Moses has to deal with everybody's grumblings one-on-one, and that's what Jethro is trying to help him out. Like, hey, stop dealing with everybody's grumblings one-on-one. You can put people in place to deal with that. And that's what I find comedic about it. One, they have collectively been grumbling this whole time, and God has shown them that, hey, I've got you. You are sustained. But it's gotten to where everybody has individual grumblings now.
Yeah.
well, and you can only imagine that the work is just the line is getting longer, not shorter.
Right. Yeah.
Thousands, hundreds, 50s, tens, and to a certain extent, Moses is dealing with some of these things. Then now they've already grumbled against him. People are going to take issue with him. So again, it's probably causing more trouble than it's worth,
right?
Or than it's solving. And so hopefully, this.
Yeah, I mean, in the very
definitely...
next chapter, this is where God is like, "Hey, I'm going to confirm my covenant with you. You are going to see me. You are going to see that I am with Moses, and we're going to enter into this relationship."
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so talking about chapter 19 with Sinai, and I think maybe that's where we'll end up, just because chapter 10 does get into the covenant or the 10 commandments and the law, so it kind of flows in next week. But I just think, man, it starts with them knowing God and God revealing himself, displaying himself, in his power and majesty and stuff, even before the law is given. And so I think about that, covenant entered into. I think about that with even how we witness, how we evangelize, how we testify amongst the world. And God, clearly we've been responding to God in what he has revealed to us. And so we kind of expect the same thing to happen with other people, that people have to see who God is before, any of the law kind of comes into place, basically. The law can point out our need for God. Absolutely. And then the law can point out, just where we are in relation to God. But I just thought it was interesting to note. And this one is conditional. This is a conditional covenant, at least a large portion of it. So he says, if indeed you obey my voice, you shall be my treasured possession. And later on, when we get into Deuteronomy, then we see, he spells it out a lot more clearly. If you keep it, then you're going to be blessed. If you don't, then ultimately you're going to be led into exile. And of course, we know that's what happens. But anything else from chapter 19? I mean, consecration required.
Yeah, I was going to point out, they have to wash their clothes, and that symbolizes the cleansing of, we're going to put off what we had and we're going to put on new, clean clothes. We're not going to defile ourselves with our wives. Like, our one true bride is waiting for us at this mountain. And so they are focusing every detail and attention toward who God is in this moment. So, yeah.
And my thoughts were, there's not a call for perfection, but you can't ignore filth.
Right.
As the idea as we approach God. And if we desire to hear from him, there's a reality where you can't ignore obvious filth and expect to hear from God.
Well, and there's the healthy fear too. It's the respect. They know that what God has said, you can't go near it. You can't touch it. You can't go up to the mountain or touch the edge of it in verse 12. People in the camp trembled in verse 16. There's some scary stuff kind of going on with what was happening. The mountain was shaking and stuff. And so, this is big. But the whole point, in verse 6, he's like, you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. That sounds familiar, right? 1 Peter, that he's called us to be a holy nation, a priesthood, a royal priesthood to the nations. Yep. And so in this case, it's the Israelites calling out those people to be a nation of priests to the world. And we are now that within the church.
Yep.
I got nothing else.
Yeah, I think that's good.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot here, and we only touched the surface in a lot of ways. But keep reading, keep seeing God in all of it. What is God revealing about Himself?
That's right.
I think is big, and how should we respond accordingly?
Yep.
That's big.
Yep.
So, yep. We'll see you guys in part 2 with the law, all the good stuff.
And if you have questions between now and then, just call one of these guys.
Talk Josh.
Yeah.